So I think our next speaker is Mark Smith, who's the director of the Office of Research and Standards. And he'll be talking about PFAS screening values in soil due to the application of residuals. So take it away, Mark.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope everybody's enjoyed their extra 3 or 4 minutes of break time here. I'm going to get right into talking about some of the more technical aspects, but not at a great level of technicality here, about approaches that we're considering for establishing screening values for PFAS in residuals. Can I get the next slide, please? All right, so how are we going to do this? That is a really good question, and we do not yet have a definitive answer. We are hoping that this stakeholder group will provide us with important information that guide us in how we can best do this. The various approaches that really we are considering all really do require the calculation of PFAS concentrations in soil. Next slide, please. Okay, and here we have a slide that we borrowed from the NEBRA website where some residuals have been dumped onto a field. And in our sort of approach to assessing this, we'll have some information regarding the concentration of the various PFAS compounds within the residuals that are being land applied. And we'll have some basis for considering the concentration of the PFAS in the soil that's receiving that application, that loading of the material. So these are base elements for the two primary approaches that we're considering for establishing screening values. Next slide, please. All right, so the overall approaches, and let me start by saying I think everybody who's involved with consideration of PFAS risks and impacts on human health and the environment have a long-term goal of trying to really virtually eliminate the longer chain PFAS compounds from the various waste stream inputs and releases to the environment. So the long chain ones would include the 6 compounds that we're regulating under the MCP and in our drinking water standard. These are of particular concern because of their extreme toxicity and their persistence in the environment. So I think that's a long-term goal that society is moving towards and has been moving towards now for a number of years, but we're certainly not there yet. And we certainly will have to deal with legacy contamination from prior, more extensive use of these compounds. In the interim, we need to have some approaches for addressing the reuse of residuals and other similar types of materials. The approaches that we're considering involve looking at background levels and establishing screening levels that are based upon those background levels to some extent. We're also looking at leaching of PFAS from residuals with a particular concern about leaching from the soils to groundwater that is used or potentially used as drinking water. Because we do know that in situations where drinking water supplies are contaminated with these PFAS compounds, that can then become a major pathway of exposure. The leaching approaches that certainly could be applied here involve potentially a worst case scenario where one just assumes all of the applied PFAS leach directly to the groundwater with little binding and little dilution. That's really worst case scenario. Is probably not terribly realistic with respect to the impacts to the groundwater, versus modeled approaches where we can use sophisticated or fairly sophisticated models to estimate the leaching of these compounds from the soils and from the biosolids to groundwater, and then their movement through the groundwater to wells or other sources of potential exposure. Now, we understand that the various models that are out there are limited, but we do think that there are a number that are potentially useful in establishing screening values. Thirdly, there are experimental approaches to deriving values based on laboratory leaching experiments or on field data. Our sense right now is that there's insufficient data to really use this information, but that could certainly change based on the input we get from you all and as information in this area changes. Of course, food chain uptake is a concern as well, and we are beginning to look at that, but our primary focus right now is on the drinking water pathway. And certainly there are perhaps other approaches that could be considered for regulating PFAS in biosolids, and we are hoping to hear from everybody on the stakeholder group here with any suggestions for other approaches that we should consider. Next slide, please. All right, so when one applies a biosolid or fertilizer or anything else to soil that contains PFAS, there is a contribution or loading of that PFAS to the soil, and that adds to the background levels that are already there. And the approaches that we're considering, just loosely call them approach A, which is to establish some allowable % increase over a background level of PFAS that already exists in the soil. Second approach, approach B, is to really focus on the leaching of PFAS from soils to the groundwater and then establish limits that would not lead to exceedances of our drinking water standards and guidelines. And an acknowledgement that there may be other approaches, approach C here, which could involve a combination of A and B or something else completely. Next slide, please. So approach A. So when we're talking about some % increase in the concentration of PFAS above the background levels, this approach basically establishes or would establish screening levels that would not exceed a specified % increase above background levels after the residuals application. So this is somewhat analogous to the approach used to establish the MCP standards, where the 90th percentile value for background was chosen as the sort of maximum limit for the concentration of these PFAS in soils. We used for the MCP approach the Vermont background data that Paul discussed previously. We used that information because it was available. It was a pretty comprehensive data set. The primary strength of this approach is that we do have data right now that we could use to establish these screening levels. And I would say that the primary weakness here is that it's not a risk-based approach. It's really just saying, all right, we already have a concentration or a level of these PFAS compounds that are already in the environment. And to achieve the benefits associated with the reuse of residuals, we might be willing to allow a small incremental increase over those background levels while we get these things phased out and eliminated from the various waste streams that are contributing to the biosolids. Next slide, please. Second approach, as I've mentioned, is to focus on leaching of PFAS into the groundwater, where that groundwater is either being used or could be used in the future as drinking water. The modeling of the leaching of PFAS really would be set to establish protective targets in groundwater used as drinking water. And as has been noted previously, we've just recently adopted a state drinking water standard for 6 of the long chain PFAS, and that would be the target that we would be looking not to exceed. The leaching modeling may include or would have to include a number of different parameters. These could include the typical area of application of the biosolids at a particular reuse location, the depth to groundwater, the frequency of application, the loading rate, how many or how much of the biosolids is added, the depth of application, including the depth to which the biosolids may be mixed or tilled into the soil, and the organic carbon content and pH, which may affect the mobility of the compounds from the soil. This approach was used by Maine to set their screening levels for PFAS and biosolids, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. And again, there are other approaches such as TCLP testing, which is typically used to address leaching from landfills, or leaching of materials at landfills. That could be applied as well, but we're not sure that the data is sufficient at this point to really address this issue through that approach. Next slide, please. All right, so what did Maine do? Maine's the first state to establish levels for PFAS in residuals. These were established in 2019. Basically, their values were established by a back calculation using a fairly conservative leaching model to estimate the concentrations of 3 compounds in biosolids and mobility to groundwater. The groundwater target in Maine is a little bit different from what we're using. It only addresses the concentration of PFAS and PFOA and was set at a level of approximately 2005 parts per trillion, so considerably higher than the target that we would be using here in Massachusetts. The levels for the target soil concentration, so this would be the concentration of the PFAS in the soil after repetitive applications of PFAS, are listed in this table in parts per trillion or nanograms per kilogram. So this is an example of an approach relying upon a leaching model, a fairly conservative leaching model, with different target concentrations in groundwater in Maine. Next slide, please. All right, so what are our current priorities? We're in the process of assessing leaching modeling options that would really expand upon the approach used by Maine. And the expansion would include the use of distributional approaches to variable data inputs. And there are a number of data inputs, which I'm not going to get into detail now, that need to be selected to go into the models. And there's variability in those data inputs. So a way to address that variability is to use a distributional approach. We're also looking at some more data-driven model parameters based on a survey of values from the literature, and data-driven groundwater flow and dilution factors, which might be different from those that were used in the Maine assessment. And also, of course, we'd be looking to align our groundwater targets with our more health protective toxicity and drinking water values, which in essence is a lower target for groundwater potentially used as drinking water, with that target being 20 parts per trillion, which is our state MCL or drinking water standard that was adopted formally last week. It is our intent to try to form a subcommittee from this group of technical experts to provide us some additional input onto these efforts. And we'll be looking to hold the first meeting of that group sometime in December. Next slide, please. So continuing efforts that we do need to ultimately address, and we're gathering information and looking at what other states and agencies are doing, relates to the potential for plant uptake from the reuse of the biosolids, the potential for runoff from land application of residuals and biosolids into surface waters, which could have impacts again on drinking water and on ecoreceptor endpoints, and continuing efforts on pollution prevention, focusing on PFAS in collaboration with other groups and other agencies. Next slide, please. All right, so again, just to recap, we really do need to consider the application and loading rates of PFAS to soils. And the next presentation that Jennifer will go into some more detail about how those calculations can be performed. Next slide, please.